This unit takes a panoramic view of export promotional strategies and analyzes the contemporary Indian scenario. After going through this lesson, you shall be able to understand the salient features of WTO, highlight WTO agreement and India's concern, discuss hurdles in export promotion, particularly of agricultural produce, suggest measures for export promotion. Export typically refer to goods and services produced within a country but consumed elsewhere in the rest of the world. For the past few decades, issues related to export promotion, growth and export-led development strategies have been occupying center stage in discussion on policy making everywhere in the world. It must be recognized that globally the policy environment is becoming increasingly complex. The dilemma most governments face, whether of developed or developing countries, is how to reconcile the conflict arising out of their international commitment under the WTO and domestic compulsions, economic, political and social. Phase out of subsidies, reduction of tariffs and greater market access are key issues under the WTO, and these issues affect different countries differently depending on their competitiveness in agriculture, manufacturing and service, etc. The developing countries, including India, must not give up their opposition to subsidies or step down the pressure. Now let us discuss about salient features of WTO. The Uruguay round started in 1986 and its agreements were signed at Marrakesh 8 years later in 1994. The World Trade Organization came into existence on 1st January 1995. It has 161 members currently and membership has been steadily growing. Its main functions are serving as a forum for negotiation among members on issues relating to international trade, administrating those agreements that result from negotiations and serving as a clean house for dispute settlement among member nations. Basically, there is only one agreement to form a World Trade Organization, but annexed thereto are 28 agreements forming a veritable forest of rules and regulations. The existing WTO agreements cover three main areas. These are trade in goods, trade in services and intellectual property. The main agreements covering these areas respectively are the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that is GATT, General Agreement on Trades and Services, that is GATS, and Agreement on Trade Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, that is TRIPS. In addition, there are several other agreements that clarify or build upon these central agreements. The WTO also has a strong dispute settlement system to address complaints by member country governments of the violation of their WTO sanctioned right by other members. Prior to the WTO, only trade in goods has been subject to genuine multilateral discipline. When the WTO was formed, GATT as an organization ceased to exist, while the GATT treaty became a part of the WTO agreements governing international trade in goods. The WTO also took over the GATT Secretariat's various functions, including the conduct of future negotiations, administration of past agreements and dispute settlement. It should be noted that the establishment of the WTO in 1995 has changed the international trade environment considerably. It is considered to be the cornerstone of the multilateral trading system, incorporating trade in goods and services and protection of intellectual property rights. Its basic objective is one of enhancing trade between countries without discrimination, and it has special provisions for both LDCs and the developing nations to help them reap the benefits of international trade commensurate with the needs of their economic development. but the smooth functioning of the organization is ridden with several obstacles. Now let us discuss about WTO agreements and India's concern. There is an imperative necessity to promote export in Indian economy. The following points highlight to justify the need for export promotion to earn foreign exchange, finance imports, correct unfavorable balance of trade, promote interest of Indian exports and keeping commitment of WTO, reduce bureaucratic hurdles, reduce external borrowings and enhance overall economic development of the country. Export promotion in terms of facilities and incentives can benefit the exports in several ways. Having these benefits of exports into consideration, the overall concern of India at WTO discussions can be broadly categorized under the following heads. These are agriculture, services, market access for non-agricultural products for industrial tariff negotiations, intellectual property that is TRIPS, trade rules, dispute settlement, trade and environment, trade debt and finance, trade and technology transfer and electronic commerce. The global trading system has seen a sharp increase in regional trade agreements or RTAs over the past few decades or so. The current WTO rules as well as those under negotiation envisage the eventual phasing out of export subsidies. This is a pointer to the direction that export promotion efforts will have to take in future, that is towards more fundamental systemic measures rather than incentives and subsidies alone. Under the WTO agreement, India committed to replacing all border barriers on agricultural products by tariffs and binding the latter. In WTO parlance, binding a tariff implies that country cannot raise the custom duty above its bound rate without renegotiation with its trading partners who would be adversely impacted by the increase in the tariff. It also undertook obligations for tariff reductions and binding them in both industry and agriculture. Other areas of commitment included liberalization in services and improved IPR standards as laid out in agreement on TRIPS. Liberalization in agriculture has been and remains the key contentious issue. India has taken the stand that it wants developed countries to liberalize their agriculture but should not be asked to reciprocate. But for a country with very limited negotiating power due to its low share in world trade, such stance is difficult to be pursued, especially when conflicting interests dominate among developing country groupings. Agriculture. Given the high stakes in agriculture and wide-ranging provisions of the Agreement on Agriculture, that is AOA, covering domestic support, export subsidies and market access continues to remain unresolved. The agriculture sector is fairly well protected in the most of the countries. A negotiation on agriculture has been the toughest nut on the platter. The agreement on market access has two dimensions, viz. Reduction in tariffs and minimum market access through tariff rate quota, that is TRQ. At present, agricultural tariffs in the developed countries are much higher than that in the industrial products. Further, the minimum access tariff quota commitments have been kept at relatively higher levels of aggregate, leaving considerable flexibility to domestic importers. Such practices amount to restricting the market access by going against the spirit of commitments undertaken. Basically, domestic support represent subsidies provided by a country to its agriculture. These subsidies may be product specific or non-product specific. Non-product specific subsidies refer to subsidies on inputs such as fertilizers, electricity, irrigation, seeds, credit, etc. The AOA classifies these supports into trade distorting and non-trade distorting. Only the trade distorting subsidies are obliged to reduction commitment as per the AOA regulation. Most of the India's agricultural products are not at par with the international standards. Therefore, foreign collaboration in export-oriented projects of agriculture could be encouraged so that the benefits under the market access provision of the WTO could be realized. Foreign collaboration may enhance professionalism in agribusiness as very few Indian agricultural products enjoy brand equity in European and North American markets. With the greater volatility in the global market of agricultural products, huge decline in international prices can be disastrous for Indian farmers. Therefore, suitable policy action are to be taken to protect the farmers from the implications of such shocks. International commitments have major implications for Indian agriculture. However, since India is a net exporter of agricultural products, it is expected that India should stand to gain in agriculture trade if the AOA is implemented effectively and trade distortions are removed. The impacts of these commitments can be explained in terms of three major aspects, which are trade competitiveness, food and livelihood securities, and marginal and small farmers. Market access in the absence of reduction of domestic support and export subsidies given in US, Japan and other developed countries would have serious adverse consequences for India if trade liberalization policies are pursued without the fulfillment of commitments by other countries. India must holistically consider all the legal, economic and political aspects of various WTO provisions. Market access for non-agricultural products. The imposition of sanitary and phytosanitary specifications should be in fashion that gives developing country exporters some time to respond and adjust. The same would apply to some technical specifications that can serve as barriers to trade. All this has a bearing on and will further strengthen the cause of the multilateral trading system. Special and differential treatment, that is S&DT, for developing countries represented an important advance in international economic law for its recognition of the principle of non-reciprocity in international economic relations. It acknowledges that there are unequal playing fields between the rich and poor and that it takes a long time to build the latter's technical, financial and infrastructural capabilities. Prosperous developing countries will be a better trading partner than one that is poor. Developed countries were adopting new protectionist measures to ensure that products from developing country did not enter their shores. Services. The Indian interest will be first and foremost in getting agreement for more liberal provisions for the temporary migration of Indian technical and non-technical workers to foreign markets. It is important for India to have positive movement on services trade for a balanced outcome. Offers from some developed countries such as the US were disappointing, especially on Mode 4, which relates to movement of natural persons in which India has critical interests. Negotiations at the WTO are mostly done with the clear strategy of give and take. There is always something in it for everybody, but not everything for anybody. Indian firms have established a strong presence in the world trade in services. Indian firms carry out a multitude of offshoring tasks from simple consumer service centers to accounting services and the various business tasks called business process outsourcing or BPOs. These are also called IT-enabled services or ITES, since they depend crucially on IT and communication technology. In fact, the major Indian IT companies such as TCS and Infosys pioneered the offshoring mode of global delivery of IT services. Indian firms account for a substantial share of world trade in IT and BPO services. India's trade in services is not confined to that in IT and ITES services. There is a substantial contribution through migration. Tourism is an old form of services export, where the foreign tourists spend her money in India. This has been growing very rapidly in the last decade or so. New forms of on-site service provision are also taking place in response to very different prices at which similar services are delivered in India and the developed countries. With high quality hospitals and well qualified doctors at the top end, India has become a new destination for what is called medical tourism. Social clause. The subject of trade and environment has been matter of controversy in the WTO almost from its beginning. Of the social clause issues, it has not been possible to prevent negotiations on environment, but the move to link labor has been relegated to the earlier position of leaving it to International Labour Organization. This means that labor issues will never be raised in future meetings of the WTO. India's consistent efforts to de-link labor standards from the WTO agenda also paid off. The Declaration on Trade and Environment envisages the reduction or the elimination of tariff and non-tariff barriers on environmental goods and services. TRIPS. The controversy over TRIPS is largely about trying to find a common ground among WTO members with contrasting aims and capabilities. The agreement was born out of the desire to impose a standard for protection of intellectual property rights. The most tangible gain has been on the TRIPS agreement and public health. It also concedes a country's right to determine what constitutes a national emergency. It reaffirms the right of the WTO members to use the provisions of the TRIPS agreement which provide flexibility for this purpose. It finally clarifies that the flexibility includes the right of each member to grant compulsory licenses. The Declaration on the TRIPS agreement and public health recognizes much flexibility, including the right to grant compulsory licenses and the freedom to determine the grounds upon which such licenses are granted. It provides each member the right to determine what constitutes a national emergency that leads to a public health crisis. This objective seeks to promote access to medicines for all, obviously at affordable prices, and may be of great help to the Indian pharmaceutical industry. With just a handful of countries endowed with the capability that requires the TRIPS shield, the road ahead is likely to be difficult. On drugs, India is in a unique position. The decision to recognize only process patents in the early 1970s allowed the domestic pharmaceutical industry to flourish. A number of Indian companies have developed the capability not only to reverse engineer a variety of drugs, but also to meet the most stringent quality standards. It is a measure of the progress made by the Indian industry that few references are made any longer to the nightmarish scenario of escalating drug prices once the country meets all the WTO obligations by 2005. India remains one of the few developing countries with the capacity to supply nations hit by epidemics with affordable copycat drugs using the compulsory licensing norms specified in the new WTO deal. Unless a satisfactory solution is found to the problem of accessibility to drugs, the WTO is likely to be viewed with distrust in large parts of the world. Geographical origin. There is a possibility of extending geographical appellations to goods other than wines and spirits and greater acknowledgement of traditional knowledge through possible harmonization of TRIPS with the Biological Diversity Convention and similar treaties. India seeks to secure protection under geographical indicator exclusively for basmati rice, Darjeeling tea, etc., and not just wines and spirits like champagne or scotch. The mandate also include a discussion on the protection of traditional knowledge and folklore. Indian interest is the protection of traditional knowledge and folklore because several American firms have been engaged in securing of patents for age-old products like neem, turmeric, etc. In short, we have to adopt a two-fold strategy in India. First, we have to enhance the competitiveness of our agriculture in the global market, which basically is made up of two components, the price competitiveness and the product quality. India's export prospects in agriculture are constrained more by domestic factors than market access limitations as of now. Our stance must be more forward-looking. India should bring about reforms in agriculture through better productivity, water management and improved distribution and transportation methods. In the world of international trade, each country pursues its interests. But the fact remains that no country is immune to adverse rulings from the WTO. A major challenge to WTO is the slow progress of multilateralism because of the proliferation of the preferential trade agreements, that is PTAs, and free trade agreements, that is FTAs. Now let us discuss about hurdles in export promotion. Many countries resorting to a form of administered protection known as non-tariff measures, that is NTMs. The ascent of NTMs holds special difficulties for India. India has the difficulties in accessing developed country markets because of restrictive standards, burdensome regulations and expensive compliance. The WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, that is ASCM, allows India to provide export subsidies as its per capita GDP on nominal terms on 1990 prices is still within $1,000. However, we will have to restructure or re-engineer our various schemes in a manner that is sustained for a long term. The textile sector has gone into the area of being competitive as defined by the WTO's ASCM law. Therefore, textile sector is now not eligible for export subsidies. A picture has been painted as if FTAs are nothing but evil. But we have to recognize that this is not the fact. India has entered into FTAs with Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia and Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that is ASEAN. Under the new foreign trade policy 2015 to 2020, the government revamped the export subsidy regime and indicated its intention to phase out subsidies for overseas shipments in compliance with rules of the World Trade Organization, while setting an ambitious export target of $900 billion to be met by 2019-20. The new policy merged all subsidy schemes for merchandise exports and service exports into two separate schemes to simplify the export subsidy regime, and for the first time included units within export-oriented special economic zones, that is SEZs, under the ambit of such incentives. In the process, the government hacked through a plethora of schemes that had been targeted at specific products and specific markets, complicating the subsidy regime. In simplifying the subsidy regime, the trade policy emphasized that the current WTO rules as well as those under negotiation envisage the eventual phasing out of export subsidies. This is a pointer to the direction that export promotion efforts will have to take in future. That is, towards more fundamental systemic measures rather than incentives and subsidies alone. There is therefore a need to ensure that our exports and services are internationally competitive. The lesson is that exports cannot be driven by SOPs, they need a lot more. Disputes regarding the anti-dumping duties imposed to prevent exporters from selling cheap in the foreign markets relative to their local markets are quite common these days. WTO allowed the provision that in case exporters are dumping their products in foreign markets, that is selling at a price lower than their average cost, they can be subjected to anti-dumping duties. This has hurt exporters from the developing world since they have to prove that their prices are legitimate in the sense that they are not artificially lowering prices to deter the entry of locals. In any case, local cost and price estimates are hotly debated issues. Also, such duties are often used as clear protection devices either to delay the entry of products or to force the exporters into arriving at some sort of settlement with local entities. India in recent times has successfully defended quite a few anti-dumping proceedings against European and American companies. To summarize, following are some of the problems being faced by India while making its efforts to promote exports. Number 1, bilateral trade agreements provide preferential treatment to the two countries involved, directly contradicting the concept of giving all WTO member states most favored nation status. Non-tariff implicit barriers to trade persist, such as in the huge agricultural subsidies of the US and EU. The primary purpose of the WTO is to promote free and fair trade, but clearly this is not achieved. The WTO retains some teeth in its ability to sanction members, though this system is deeply flawed in its inability to correct for inequitable distribution of resources among members. Number 4, the case for a lack of trade barriers is not settled. In recent years, scholars like Danny Roderick, Martin Wolf and Tom Friedman are more staunch believers in free trade, but even they caution against complete removal of trade barriers. This indicates that a completely enthusiastic approach to free trade is not tenable among academic heavyweights of any ilk. Number 5, trade negotiations are like a cycle ride. They have to be running to maintain balance and keep going. The full agenda of freeing multilateral international trade will possibly never be completed. The negotiators advance a few paces and then realize that the agenda needs to be broadened if the whole process is to make any sense and bring the desired benefits. Now let us discuss about the measures for export promotion. The Ministry of Commerce is a primary government agency responsible for countries' external trade, including commercial relations with other countries, state trading and various trade promotional measures, as well as for development and regulation of certain export-oriented industries. The trade promotion policy of a country is comprised of programs and measures that promote and develop trade with other countries. It includes all regulations and practices that will increase exports. Trade promotion policies are part of the overall foreign trade policy and cannot be considered alone. The keys to successful national export promotion and development programs are government policy decisions that affect export trade. Having completed 2 decades of its existence, during which WTO has evoked the entire spectrum of opinion from being the savior of the global economy to the destroyer of the less developed countries. What is needed is the identification of areas that need improvement for greater credibility, more confidence and larger commitment for meaningful progress in trade liberalization. An immediate task before the WTO is to finish the Doha round and ensure effective implementation. On issues relating to the farm sector, different forms of subsidies are most contentious. All forms of subsidies are trade distorting and should be phased out without any condition. Elimination of all forms of subsidies will result in free and fair trade. If this happens, the developing and the least developed countries will start to gain. India has to learn to think strategically. India has moved away from its earlier protectionist stance and has much to gain from trade liberalization. India has opposed the inclusion of services in the Uruguay round, but has gained considerably from the exports of commercial services. Also, fears of foreign competition can be exaggerated. Arvind Panigreya has stressed that it is important for India to take a more pro-liberalization stance insofar as trade is concerned. A country's own liberalization brings benefits to it, as India has learned from its liberalization experience over the last 25 years. Through multilateral negotiations, it can multiply this benefit by getting its partners to liberalize as well. Such liberalization will also help end the discrimination that already exists against its products in North America and Europe due to existence of trade blocs in those regions. The liberalization of international transactions cannot be seen in isolation. Trade policy reform is not a smooth, frictionless process. The modalities of external liberalization need to be considered. External liberalization does not take place in vacuum. It must be seen in the context of domestic institutional change. Regional trade agreements involve two or more countries getting together to regulate trade. Moreover, progress on market access and rule making through RTAs could be transposed in due course to the WTO, that is, RTAs should act as building blocks for the multilateral liberalization. Decision-making process at the WTO has never been above board. This system is now being overhauled. While consensus is the backbone of the WTO, the spirit of mutual accommodation is totally missing. If one simply takes into account the wide-ranging debates within the WTO over the last decade, what needs to be addressed in the coming years is a broader issue of reforming the WTO. The delay in the agricultural talks is holding up progress in goods and services liberalization, which is economically far more significant. Without a significant breakthrough, the agricultural talks, the big emerging markets, are unlikely to agree radical liberalization of their goods and services markets. In this context, Professor Roderick's main prescription is that developing countries should have wide leeway to follow heterodox trade policies, which may include trade protection and selectively interventionist domestic industrial policies. The precise policy mix should be contingent on circumstances and institutional capacity, varying inevitably from country to country. Finally, a development safeguard clause akin to the social safeguard clause should be inserted into WTO to allow for such discretionary policies. The Roderick version deserves to be taken more seriously. He warns against simplistic generalizations and one-size-fits-all blueprints, rather favoring policy choice tailored to local circumstances and institutional capacity. International economic integration is essentially a positive sum game, not an engine of marginalization and exclusion. India will need to restructure its export promotion schemes by making them less dependent on government support to be WTO compliant, as several developed countries were raising concerns over India's export promotion schemes. Now let us summarize what we have learned from this module. The Uruguay round of 1986 to 94 led to the WTO was established in 1995, has 161 member countries, a forum for trade negotiations, and sets the global rule governing trade between its members. The WTO remains the only international economic forum in which developing countries are on an equal footing with their rich country counterpart. Its main function is to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. WTO is designed to play the role of a watchdog in the sphere of trade in goods, trade in services, foreign investment, intellectual property rights, etc. WTO's procedure for resolving trade quarrels under the dispute settlement understanding is vital for enforcing the rules and therefore for ensuring that trade flows smoothly. India is one of the founding members of WTO. India has taken several steps to implement the policy commitments made under some of the agreements. There are some issues on which India has expressed certain reservations. Developed countries have not fulfilled their obligations in the letter and spirit of the WTO agreements. Agriculture is a politically very sensitive issue, and therefore liberalization of this sector is a difficult task. The AOA aims to eliminate distortions in agriculture trade through reducing export and production subsidies and by removing import barriers, including the non-tariff barriers. World trade in agriculture is still highly distorted, mainly because the developed countries have not kept to their commitments of reducing the support extended to their agricultural producers. Aggressive pursuit of India's interest at WTO should carefully balance specific sectoral interest with broader economic and consumer interests. Many of the special and differential treatment clauses in favor of developing countries added in various WTO agreements have remained inoperational. WTO has not been able to ensure abolition of non-trade barriers being imposed on labor and environmental considerations. The Doha Declaration focused mainly on agricultural services, TRIPS agreement, public health, trade and environment, and the implementation related issues and concerns. But so far, no tangible progress has been made. India should worry about the multilateral trading system. It is in India's interest to accept WTO discipline and take steps to keep its house in order, including agriculture and export competitiveness. Modernizing of agricultural processing will not only enhance our export market potential but also aid in improving the domestic food quality. Major problems being faced by India are declining prices of primary commodities as well as fluctuations in their prices, the barriers to trade, standards that are being imposed, and the cost of compliance with various provisions of the WTO agreements.